Hello and welcome to another Meema Makes tutorial. In this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to sew hexagons together with this join. It is actually a sewn join using a stitch called the whip stitch. So you can use it for any hexagon pattern, but I'm going to be using my Hexadaisy Blanket pattern for this demonstration, and I will link the pattern in the description if you would like to learn how to make this blanket. So the final round of my blanket, into each stitch along the side of the hexagons, I have done a single crochet if you use US terms, or a double crochet if you use UK terms, into the top of each stitch. And then I've done 3 of those stitches into each corner space. So this means that my corner is this second stitch of my 3 single crochet or double crochet group of that corner. So it doesn't matter what hexagon pattern you use, this will work as long as you can identify where that corner is. And if you struggle, pop a locking stitch marker through that corner stitch, because it will make it a lot easier to work out where you are and reorient yourself when you're sewing hexagons together. Because with hexagons we've got lots of angles, we haven't got a nice grid like we have with granny squares, so that's really helpful. My other tip is, before I do a join, I actually join it temporarily with those locking stitch markers again, and this stops my hexagons or my granny squares flip-flopping around and me getting all confused. So the other thing to note is my Hexadaisy blanket comes with a half hexagon motif in the pattern, and this is to straighten 2 sides of my hexagon blanket. So if you are using a different pattern, you just need to know where your corners are on those half hexagons, or your pattern might not even have half hexagons. So the thing to note is, if you are using the Hexadaisy pattern and you're referring to this tutorial, I do indicate where you need to put your stitch markers in these half hexagons in that written pattern, because it is in a different place to these. It's actually in it's in that 3 single crochet group in the corner, but it's actually the one off to one side rather than the central one. So just make sure you know where your corners are before you start this join, because otherwise you're going to find it quite difficult. Okay, so when we're sewing hexagons together for this blanket, what I decided to do is I actually joined them in strips and then put the strips together, and I'll pop some footage of that on the screen now. So to join our hexagons into strips, what we're going to do is we're going to just sew down one side of these hexagons to make one long strip of hexagons like I've made here. So in the pattern for my Hexadaisy blanket, I do recommend you finish off with an invisible join, because it makes your sewing together a lot easier than having to deal with that slip stitch bump. But you can do a slip stitch if you prefer, but make sure you've left your tail really long. So it takes approximately 16 centimeters or just over 6 inches of yarn to sew down one side of your square. So that should indicate to you how long you need to leave that end, or how long you need to cut a piece of yarn for if you haven't left your end long. So I've left quite a long end here because I like to do overkill a little bit, and I use my ends to stuff amigurumi anyway, so I'm not too worried about wasting yarn. So I've threaded that end onto a yarn needle, and then I'm going to just quickly remove this temporary stitch marker so we can see what we're doing. So whether you're joining a half hexagon and a hexagon or 2 hexagons, this is exactly the same. So we're going to hold them wrong sides together, so the right sides are facing out. And this is my yarn end here that I've got threaded onto a needle. So to make sure our stitches are aligned, we're not going to start in the hexagon that is closest to us. We're actually going to go into the hexagon here. So I'm just going to turn this hexagon corner slightly, and you can see we've got our 1, 2, 3 stitches in the corner. If you do need a stitch marker here, then take that stitch marker out, because we're about to put our needle into that space. So from the back, I'm putting my yarn needle, hopefully you can see that there, putting my yarn needle under both of those loops of the V at the top of the stitch. So at the top of the stitch we've got this V that looks a bit like a chain. That's where we put our hook when we make a stitch, and for this join that's where we're going to be sewing. So I'm going to put my yarn needle through, and then I'm going to pull the yarn through, but I'm not going to pull super tight. I'm just going to pull enough to join those 2 together, just like that. You can see, you can't really see there's any yarn there. You can't see any yarn there, but they're nice and snug together, but I've not pulled this stitch really tight here where the end is joined. So now I'm going to work from, for all the stitches along this side now, I'm going to work from this side first. So I'm going to put my yarn needle under both of the loops of that central single crochet of that corner again. And then I'm going to put my needle through the top of the stitch under both of those loops to the stitch next to that stitch we've already sewn. So hopefully you can see that there. I'm not going back into the same stitch, I'm going into the next stitch along. And then we're going to repeat this all the way along. So I'm going to move over to the next stitch, which is this one, because that's where we've just, you can see that's our stitch there. And then we go into the next stitch. So I've gone under both of those loops of both hexagons, and I'm going along. And then in the next stitch, we're going to do it again. So we're going under both the loops of the, sorry, I can hear my cat playing in the next room. Right, let's carry on. If you hear any funky noises, that's what's going on. So I'm going under both of the loops at the top of the stitch of the next two stitches along. And when I'm pulling it, I'm not pulling it tight, but I'm not leaving it loose, it's snug. So you can see there. So we're talking about tension again. When we're making our stitches, tension is really important. And here, also when you're sewing, you want them to be snug, but you don't want them to be super tight or super baggy. So we're going to go through both of the loops at the top of the stitch of the next stitches along, and we're literally just going to repeat this all the way along. And hopefully this is starting to make sense of how these are going to be joined together. So like I said, this stitch is called whip stitch. There are lots of different sewing stitches you can use to join your crochet squares and hexagons, but this is the one that I've chosen for this blanket. So you can see I'm going through both of the squares here, and I'm moving one stitch along for every stitch. Sometimes you might make a mistake, you might go through the same stitch twice, or you might accidentally skip a stitch. This is completely fine, as long as you then accommodate this later on. So you might have to go back through the same stitch twice at, say, at the next corner, just to even it all out. I did this quite a few times when I was sewing this blanket together, and I don't think it's very obvious, so don't worry too much if your corners don't quite align at the end of each seam. As long as you know where your corners are and you reorient yourself every time you sew a seam, then that's okay. So we're getting close to this corner now, so I'm just going to move that stitch marker. So again, I'm still doing that same technique. That's our last stitch, so I'm going through the next two stitches that haven't been sewn through. And then we're getting to the end of this seam now. So if we look here, my next stitch is the first stitch of this 3 single crochet if you're in the US, or double crochet if you're in the UK, 3 single crochet corner. So I'm going to go through that stitch there, and then on the back, if we have not managed to skip any stitches, or if we've managed to keep our stitch count, you should be coming through that central stitch, that very corner stitch just there. And then our last stitch is going to be a half stitch. We're just going to go through the front one. Do you remember we started at this corner, we just went through the back one? That's to get our stitches lined up on the front. So we only went through one here. We're now going to do the same at this end, like this. So when I've done this, I do like to just secure off with just a little loop knot thing. So I pick a loop at the back of one of these and I literally just go through, and that just stops those stitches coming loose before we get to sewing our ends in. I've not been very good at sewing the ends into my blanket so far, so you can sew as you go, but I tend to leave mine till the end. So yeah, I've just made like a little sort of knot there just to stop it from coming apart. So that's that seam here. So now I'm going to show you how to join 2 strips of hexagons together, because we're going to have to, first of all, we're going to be joining this corner here, which can be a little confusing, and then we're going to be here, and then we're going to be up here. So it's a little less straightforward, but don't worry, I'm going to take you through it all step by step. Okay, so here I've got 2 seams that I'm joining, and I prefer to start on my right side and work across to the left, just like if we were crocheting. So that's just my preference. You might prefer to start this side. It's totally fine. This method will still work. So I haven't left a long tail for this because there aren't actually any tails at this corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of yarn. So I've worked out you need approximately 2.5 times the length of the seam that you're doing for this stitch. So I've got 6 hexagons here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lay this piece of yarn and I'm going to go across all of these 6 hexagons once, and then I'm going to go back twice, and then I'm going to do about half. So about 2.5 times the width of your blanket for this. You might still end up with quite a long thread at the end, but you can just trim that down, and it's better to have too much than too little, trust me. You don't want to be skimpy on this. So I've got my very long piece of yarn, and it gets easier. The more of this seam we do, the shorter this gets and the easier it gets. It can feel a bit, to begin with, it can feel a little bit like, oh, I'm pulling on this stitch a lot, but don't worry, it will work itself out. So I'm going to thread that stitch on there, and then here is the other end of my yarn. So if you remember when I was talking about the half hexagons, the corner is actually not in the center, it's here. So we just need to remember that when we're joining this very first stitch. So what I'm going to do to secure my end is I'm going to do similar to what we did at the end of the last seam. I'm going to go under a loop at the back of a stitch in this corner. I'm going to pull that very long piece of yarn through, leave a long enough tail to weave in. I usually leave about 6 inches, and then I'm going to tie just a little knot so that I've got something to pull against when I'm tightening these stitches. Okay, so I'm going to leave my stitch marker on this corner of this half hexagon so you can see what I mean about the corner being a little bit off. Okay, so I'm going to put my needle into the stitch that stitch marker is in, that one that's in the corner of my half hexagon. So I'm gonna go under both those loops just like we did at the beginning of the last seam. You can see I've got a very long end thread through. I will start speeding it up for you as we get through some more stitches. So then my next stitch, I'm going in the corner stitch of this hexagon, which is that central stitch in that corner. And then I'm going through the next stitch along. Remember, we're not going back into the same stitch, we're going into the next stitch along. I'm going to pull that long out yarn end through. And remember, we're pulling snug but not super tight. And then we're going to repeat what we were doing with those other hexagons all the way along. We're going under both loops of both stitches on each of the 2 hexagons, and then every stitch we're moving along 1 stitch. So you're going to repeat this step all the way along until we get up to this corner here, and I'll show you how we navigate this corner here. Okay, so I'm almost at this corner here, so we'll just keep stitching along. So my next stitch is through the hexagon that's closest to me. It's through the first stitch of this 3 single crochet corner, but my second stitch is that central corner here. So that indicates to me that this is my last stitch through this pink half hexagon, and my next stitch is going to be into this minty green square instead. So I'm just going to pull that long yarn end through and pull it snug. So my next stitch is now going to be this central single crochet here, and my next stitch is going to be into the central single crochet of this minty green square there. There we are. And then for this stitch, I'm actually not going to move on to the same one. This is the only time we do this is when we're in one of these corners, because what we want is we want our stitches to form almost a triangle. So in that central stitch, we've got a stitch connecting these two, stitch connecting these two, and a stitch connecting these two here. So I'm actually going to go back into that central single crochet here. And then on the next stitch over, that's where I'm going. I'm not going back in that central stitch there. That is the only time we go through a central stitch, is when we're on one of these corners. So I'm just going to pull that stitch through. And then we're back to stitching as normal. So we're just moving on to the next stitch on this hexagon and the next stitch on this hexagon, just like we've done with all of our other seams. And then you're going to sew all the way down into this corner here, and I'll show you how we navigate this corner. It's quite similar to this one, but our double stitch is actually going to be on this square, not square, hexagon is actually going to be on this hexagon here. So I will just zoom along this sewn join here and show you how we navigate this last corner. So here we are at this corner. So my next stitch is into the first stitch of this dark greeny square here, so that first single crochet of that corner, and then my next stitch is that central single crochet of that minty green hexagon there. I keep calling them squares, they are hexagons, I promise. Okay, so now we're going to do that stitch again, where we're going back into the same stitch twice, but the stitch we're going into twice here is this minty green, because these corners are already connected, but this hexagon needs to connect to this hexagon and this hexagon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle into that central stitch here. We're not going back into this same stitch here, we're actually, you sometimes have to wiggle your work around a bit, we're actually going in there. So you can see where that very last stitch of that seam is there. We're going back into that stitch there, and then we're going up into that minty green stitch there. So we're going, so this stitch is being worked twice and this stitch is being worked twice. And this just means you don't need to do this, but I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I like my corners to be nice and equal and symmetrical, that's not the right word, nice and even across the whole blanket. Every corner is the same, you know. So then my next stitch, I'm going into the central single crochet of this purple square here, but I'm going into the next stitch along of that minty green square. So I'm hoping that makes sense for you. It's kind of hard to explain, you need to do it sort of alongside me, I think, to understand where I'm putting my needle and why I'm doing it, to produce that sort of three-way stitch there. So we've got one there, and one there, and that joins those three corners together quite neatly. So we're just going to continue sewing our hexagons together into strips until we've sewn together a whole blanket. If you found this tutorial helpful and you'd like to see more from me, then please subscribe. I've also popped a tutorial on the screen now of a join as you go method you could also adapt to be used for hexagons too. Happy hooking!